But I have a question that I want us to think about. Where did Paul get his theology from? Where did he get these ideas? How did he get to the place where he could discuss and talk about and understand rulers, authorities, principalities, all these different beings? Like, how did he get there? Well, I want to suggest to you that the Apostle Paul got them from his Old Testament. You see, when the writers of the New Testament were writing their stuff, the New Testament didn't exist. So they had their Old Testament. And so what I want to do is I want to go through some interesting passages in the Old Testament that I think the Apostle Paul drew on that helped him formulate his New Testament theology, and then that will help us then take that and interpret it and apply it to our modern day. But it all starts in the Old Testament. And so I want to just go through now some verses that, as I mentioned earlier, I'd be very shocked and surprised if those of you listening or watching to this heard of these verses, especially heard them taught in this context. And so I want to begin with a quote from the Lexham Bible Dictionary. Okay, so we're going to try to discover where the Apostle Paul got his theology of territorial spirits, territorial entities. And the scholar writes this. He says, most Bible translations show that Israel believed in an assembly of heavenly hosts under the authority of Yahweh. So an assembly of heavenly hosts under the authority of Yahweh. Now, modern translations do not show clearly this assembly is similar to pantheons of ancient Near Eastern cultures. A close reading of the Hebrew text and comparisons with other ancient non-biblical texts from Canaan demonstrate this similarity. So, what's this scholar talking about? He's saying that in the ancient Near Eastern cultures, there was a common belief amongst all of them that there was this pantheon of gods, these beings that ruled and oversaw the nations. That every nation, in a sense, had its own god or gods that led them, that the nation would worship and honor and serve, but each nation had their own. And this idea was prevalent in the entire ancient Near Eastern culture. And guess what? The Bible is no different. Now, clearly right now, some of you may be thinking, what do you mean the Bible speaks of a pantheon of gods? I thought there was just one God. We're going to get into that. The Bible doesn't speak of it in those terms, but it does speak about the reality that there is an assembly that God put in place to govern the nations, right? Greek mythology, Roman mythology, the all the ancient Near Eastern mythologies, they all had their own take on who the gods were and who governed the nations and all that kind of stuff. But the Bible has its own. And that's what I want to highlight. But this idea that was prevalent in the ancient Near East and the ancient Near Eastern cultures is very much biblical. Now, the last example, this is the biggest one. This is the biggest example that hits this point that I think Paul was drawing on, and where we can then take what the text says here and apply it to our own day today. And it's Psalm 82. It says, God, in verse 1, it says, God takes his position or his place in the assembly. He judges in the midst of the gods. Now, again, some translations get it wrong here and they mix it up. And you'll see he judges in the midst of the rulers. But that is obscuring what's actually going on. In the Hebrew, this is what it actually reads. So God, Elohim. Now we all know the term Elohim is one of the titles for God. So typically though, when we hear that, we're used to thinking of, capital G-O-D, Elohim. But Elohim doesn't just speak of Yahweh in the Bible. And I don't have time to go into it all in this particular episode, but there are 5 or 6 ways that the term Elohim is used. 5 or 6 distinct beings that are all described as Elohim. So you can think of the term Elohim as being a spiritual being. Something that lives in the unseen realm is an Elohim. So verse 1 says, Elohim takes his place or his position in his assembly. He judges in the midst of the Elohim. Now, the plural form for Elohim is still Elohim. Like in English, the word sheep, for example. Whether you're talking about 1 sheep or 795 sheep, it's still the same word. Plural for sheep is still sheep. It's not like sheeps. So the same is true with Hebrew. And the word Elohim, whether it's singular or it's plural, it's still the word Elohim. And so when you're reading this, and again, I have no idea about Hebrew grammar, so I'm just kind of going off of stuff that I've learned, and so bear with me if I'm being confusing. But so you have God, which is singular, takes his place or his position in his assembly. Now, when you see the word assembly, it is speaking of a group of beings. You can't have an assembly of one, right? And then it says he judges in the midst of the Elohim, the gods. Well, you can't be in the midst of one. So what you have here in verse 1 is you have Elohim, you have Yahweh, standing or taking his position in his assembly in the midst of other gods. In the midst of other gods. So what the writer is not talking about is he's not talking about a pantheon, right? There's no pantheon of gods here. The way you can look at this is this way. Yahweh is Elohim, but no other Elohim is like Yahweh. He is the one true, distinct, utterly different, and holy being. But what you have here is you have God in the midst of other gods, lower Elohim. Now, follow with me. Keep in mind Deuteronomy 32. And so that's the first verse. Now, when you keep reading, Psalm 82 goes on to describe how God, he accuses the other Elohim of corruption, and he sentences them to die like mankind. Now, so here's the setting. Here's what's going on. Psalm 82 is talking about how you have God who's standing in the midst of other gods, and he's judging them. Because when God put them over the nations back in Deuteronomy 32 at the Tower of Babel, when he put the sons of God, these Elohim, over the other nations, instead of administering his authority in a godlike fashion, what they began to do was they began to mistreat the people. They began to receive worship from the people. They became corrupt. And so when you look at all of the nations of the world in history, and I would argue even to today, and you look at all of the gods of all the nations, it all comes back to right here. These sons of God, these divine beings that God put in charge to rule over them for a time, but that were to rule according to his ways and his methods, they became corrupt and then began to receive worship, receive praise. They began to mistreat the people. And this is how you get all of the corruption and all of the mythology and all of the stuff that each separate nation had developed. All of that deception, all of that stuff happened through these sons of God not administering true godlike character and rule. And so in Psalm 82, you have then God judging them, pronouncing his judgment. Now, there are people that will look at this and they'll say, this is not speaking of divine beings. I don't care what the Hebrew says, Elohim, it's speaking of human rulers. And you will hear this pushback a lot if you choose to study this and go more in depth. But to respond to that criticism, because you will come across it, in Psalm 89, we have this same kind of language. In Psalm 89, verses 5 to 7, it says that it places the God of Israel again in the assembly of the holy ones. And it says, "For then who in the clouds can be compared to Yahweh? Who is like Yahweh among the sons of God, a God greatly feared in the council of the holy ones?" There's no cloud. There's no group of human elders floating in the clouds, right? That language is always speaking of divine beings. And so Psalm 82 is not talking about human rulers. It's talking about God judging beings that were to guard and govern nations, but that became corrupt, began to administer corruption, began to receive worship and honor and praise, and led these people away from Yahweh. So God's judging them. But here we see, and again, I may have butchered that. I could have explained it better, but I'm not doing this over again. So we're just going to keep this and keep going. But this idea that in Deuteronomy 32, just to quickly recap, Deuteronomy 32, when God splits up the nations according to their languages, he splits them up, assigns sons of God, Elohim, lower Elohim, to rule over them for a time, who then become corrupt and who then lead these nations away from Yahweh, begin to receive praise and honor and adoration, and they corrupt the people. And this is how you get all of the false religion, false belief system, false mythology, all of that stuff. Behind all of that were these entities that were in charge, in place, instituted by God to rule, but did not do it correctly. So that's a high view level of what's happening in the Old Testament that I think Paul drew from. So when we get into the New Testament, and we're talking about principalities, powers, rulers, thrones, dominions, spiritual forces of darkness, all of these different entities that Paul's talking about, these territorial entities, these are geographical entities. We see he's drawing upon the Old Testament theology of this divine council of beings that God had put over the nations to rule, but who did not do it correctly.